Welcome to Close Listening. I'm your host, Zach Morgenstern. I'm joined by my fairly silent co-host, Ludwig von B. Say hello to the nice people, Ludwig. Well, I think you know who Ludwig is. Me, I'm a singer-songwriter. I make mostly DIY albums, and I post them on Bandcamp, which if you haven't heard of it's kind of like hipster iTunes. It's basically, there's not the red tape for uploading your stuff. And people can stream for free, they just have to pay to do the download. And, as an indie musician, that's always appealed to me. I wish I could have albums that I could sell at record stores, but the next best option is at least have an online platform that really formats your stuff as an album. But I also want to be part of this bigger musical community, be part of the conversation, whatever that is. So I've decided I'm going to put my songs on YouTube, and I'm also going to start, talking about music, talking about my passions on YouTube. And a great way to do that would be to do this close listening series. So what is close listening, you ask? Well, I'm just borrowing the expression close reading and applying it to albums. I'm listening to albums and I'm thinking about what I like about them, what I don't, and how they fit into the story of who an artist is and what was going on in music. Pretty casual conversation. It's basically just a reaction video, but it's an opportunity for me to listen to some great albums and, see what you think. So, Ludwig, what is the album for today? That would be Listen Without Prejudice, Volume 1, George Michael. Now, this cover really irks me, because what does Listen Without Prejudice mean, Ludwig? It refers to the fact that George Michael did not want you to listen to this album because he was George Michael. He wanted you to just listen to it as a piece of music. So the actual album back in the day just had an old photograph on the cover, an interesting looking photograph that did not have George Michael anywhere in it. This is actually a 2017 release. It's a double CD featuring the original album and a live concert. But what is the story exactly behind Listen Without Prejudice? Well, the reason I chose to listen to this one had to do with reading a book called Uncommon People, The Rise and Fall of the Rock Stars by a music journalist named David Hepworth. And the reason I picked up that book is I liked the way its structure was described. So basically what it does is it defines rock and roll as the era of music running from 1955 to 1995. So basically start with Little Richard, end with Kurt Cobain. And every year he tried to focus in on one rock star and sort of tell the story of what they gave to the development of rock and roll. So at the beginning it was very easy. So you have Little Richard, who's the first rock star, Elvis Presley, who's the first rock idol, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, who begin to popularize the idea of the band. Then you have Hank Marvin of the Shadows, who begins to popularize this idea that rock and roll is really about the lead guitarist, and so on and so on. But eventually starts to get to a point where there's not really a defining rock star of the year because, rock becomes an older genre and it's harder for it to really innovate while still being itself. Hepworth basically takes the position of defining rock and pop as separate worlds, which, is questionable. I'm not a big believer in genre. I actually contacted him and he said he's not a big believer in genre either. So it's, whatever. Rock is whatever you want rock to be. But anyway, in 1993, he sort of focuses his chapter on Prince, because that's the year where Prince declares that he declares that he's this unpronounceable symbol, and journalists start referring to him as the artist formerly known as Prince. And basically, Prince was unhappy with his record label. He started describing himself as a slave and basically saying he had all this great music he wanted to produce, but the record label was sort of limiting his output because they figured, if the market is overly saturated with Prince music, it's going to lose its commercial value. We have to rein him in a little bit and market an album once in a while when we think we can get the most profits of it. And Prince wasn't happy about that. He saw himself as an artist, not something to be marketed. So anyway, in 1993, George Michael finds himself taking the same position as Prince, and he's actually suing his record label. And this lawsuit is connected, again, to our album of the day, Listen Without Prejudice, Volume 1. George Michael in the suit is alleging that his label failed to promote this album as much as he would have liked. It didn't do nearly as well commercially as his past work. And he was alleging the reason why was basically that this was him, making more creative decisions, being more of an artist, so to speak, and this didn't fit with the label's view of George Michael as pop star. Additionally, he wasn't happy with the fact that he'd signed a long-term contract with this record label, and he's saying that, companies shouldn't be able to give these kind of terms to musicians because a musician is not going to be able to anticipate. This means that their ability to be a musician, a creative, an artist, is going to be suppressed. Now, the case didn't go so well for George Michael. Basically, the court looked at him and saw a wealthy musician who had access to lawyers and said, you were in a position to bargain. And the record label said, look, it's part of the economics of investing in artists that we have to be able to sign them for several year-long deals. Because if we're going to invest in them, we need to know that they can be a continued source of profit for us. So, it's hard to know exactly how to think about the nuances of the case. My instinct is, of course, to side with the artists over the company owners, and certainly to lean towards, George Michael's fight for more artistry over, more commercialism. But I think the criticism that people levy at George Michael, certainly David Hepworth does in his book, and if you look up this album, it's generally what you're going to see people saying about it, that it just doesn't make sense to listen to a musician, quote unquote, without prejudice, that it's just some great art in the abstract, and you can just look at some classical photograph and hear the tunes, and you can just coincidentally like it as much as any other George Michael record or any other great record. I can certainly understand why George Michael would want to divorce his name from his art, but with no disrespect to George Michael, it's hard to think that's possible. Think of an album as weird as Black Star. If David Bowie's name wasn't attached to that very weird title track in particular, would a lot of people listen to it? I mean, it probably took a lot of certain kinds of skills to make it, but it's not necessarily the most pleasing thing to the ear. But what makes it listenable is the fact that this is the dark, more literary, more tragic follow-up to the man who in the past had written outer space songs like Space Oddity and Ziggy Stardust, and now space has really taken him to the place of death. A lot of people will say Black Star is a great album, but I don't think they would say that without prejudice. It's because it's part of the story of Bowie. And the way I think of it is, music in the age of albums, it's kind of like novels. Like, you pick these things off the shelf, they have their spine, they have their author on them, but then unlike a literary novel, lots of the time, the author is on the cover. So I almost think of music as an art form as constantly writing, whether directly or very indirectly, your autobiography and making it into autofiction. So is listening without prejudice possible? I don't know. But anyway, so the actual album. I listened to it, and at first I wasn't that impressed. I thought, okay, George, you've messed up with this whole listen without prejudice thing. I listened to it a few more times, and I decided I thought there was something there. But I don't think he succeeds on the listen without prejudice front. So if you look inside the insert, it says George Michael was trying to re-listen to and incorporate into his music various artists, including the Beatles, the Stones, Joni Mitchell. That one makes a bit more sense than the last two. And then also some salsa and Brazilian musicians, João Gilberto, Antonio Carlos Jobim, and the Gypsy Kings. And you can really hear those on what I think counts the most famous song from the album, Freedom 90. So let's just go through the songs here. So I think the thing that really made it hard for me to listen to the album the first time was this opening song called Praying for Time. And it's a shame because there's something to the lyrics there. But I think in trying to create this album that was high art, George Michael tried to drastically change his production, I guess, so moving away from synthesizers towards quote-unquote more acoustic instruments. But the problem is it doesn't really sound like an acoustic album either, so it doesn't sound like you're listening to a Cat Stevens record or something, because right away it starts with these lush strings. Now, don't get me wrong, I like a lot of sappy music with, pop with orchestration. I like the Cat Stevens songs that go there. I like Neil Diamond. I like plenty of music that goes there. But he's right away on the violins. There's no building up. And I think it must have just seemed to him at the time like, classical instrumentation suggests moving away from pop. And it's this kind of needless rebelliousness. The other problem is George Michael set out to make this smart album without quite knowing what he wants to say. I think a lot of the songs on the record are about wanting the freedom to say something, about wanting to have something to say, but not quite. So Praying for Time, I do like the lyrics. It says, the rich declare themselves poor, and most of us are not sure if we have too much, but we'll take our chances. So, I mean, it sounds like a knock at celebrity activism, but there's nothing George Michael could do. You know, he's a well-off musician, and I think he did have good politics, but, you know, he can't really escape the prison of celebrity activism. But who's he identifying with here? Who is he contrasting himself against? I'm not really sure. But, you know, good lyrics nonetheless. This is the year of the guilty man. Your television takes a stand and you find that what was over there is over here. So the next song is Freedom 90, and that's where you really get into the Brazilian influences. It's an unmistakable rhythm, and it forces him to sing a little faster. And this song is called Freedom 90. There's no mention of the number 90 in there because it's Freedom and it came out in 1990. And earlier Wham had a hit with another song called Freedom. And personally, I like that song better, even though it's a simpler pop song. And I think the original Freedom is an illustration of how, you know, you don't need to reject pop and rock to create high art, because sometimes there can be a great idea in simplicity. So Freedom comes out in the mid-'80s. It's the age of Reagan and Thatcher, when freedom has been equated with America, rah-rah, and possibly Britain, rah-rah, I don't really know, but the idea of free markets and the idea of crushing the communists and so on and so on. And here's this pop singer, George Michael, singing, I Don't Want Your Freedom. Now, in the context of that song, he's in a relationship with a partner who just wants to sleep around, and he wants to be monogamous, and he's being sensitive about this. But it feels like it has bigger philosophical implications, because I don't think George Michael is attacking polyamory. He's attacking the sort of nihilistic freedom of this partner who doesn't care about his feelings. But anyway, on to Freedom 90. It's one of these songs where George Michael is talking about how he wants to be free, to be a better kind of artist, puts down the kind of work he did for MTV in the past. And maybe this is why he lost his case, because he basically had the freedom on this album to put down his label and MTV and others associated with him. And they didn't seem to penalize him too hard, not in any overt way. So as if you're an institutionally conservative actor like a judge, that's probably going to work against George Michael. But anyway, again, this one is an interesting song. I think it would have been a better opener than Praying for Time, though I still think the complexity of the rhythm suppresses the lyrics a bit. So next you have a Stevie Wonder cover called They Won't Go When I Go. Doesn't sound that different than the Stevie version, though George Michael goes for more of a choral effect here. And again, he's talking about some abstract notion of freedom, wanting to be real, wanting to make real art in choosing this song. No more lying friends, wanting tragic ends, though they do pretend. They won't go where I go. So his record producer and MTV won't go for this high art that George Michael wants to aspire to. The next track on the album was the first one that I thought was really good, and again, this would be a better contender for opening the album, Something to Save. Lyrically, again, it's the same. George Michael wants something to say, though he's not quite sure what it is. If you've got something to say, why don't you say it? If you've got something to give, why don't you give it to me? Day after day, I have to say it. We're moving further from heaven and closer to the deep blue sea. What I like about this one, though, sonically, is he brings in the guitar. And the guitar might not be as artsy an instrument as the strings, whatever that means, but it has a rawness, and this sort of pushes your ears towards listening to the vocals and actually listening to the ideas. So I actually think the simplicity of guitar is better for quote-unquote listening without prejudice than are the strings. So the next song is Cowboys and Angels, and he explained that this was about an awkward relationship situation where he was in love with a man and a woman was in love with him, and no one really knew what was going on. And it's a really slow song. Wikipedia actually classifies it as jazz. I sort of thought of it as jazz-like. And I think the one problem with George Michael's voice for jazz is it's too nice. It just blends into the instrumentation, so it just ends up all being smooth and, you know, with no distinct vocal edge. It's not like Sinatra or even Michael Bublé, where the voice has a little pop compared to the nice velvety music in the background. There is a cool saxophone solo in there, but basically, I think when it comes to bringing jazz into popular music, I like the campy jazz, to be honest, of Careless Whisper, rather than the more genuine jazz of Cowboys and Angels. Then there's Waiting for the Day. George Michael describes this as a slowed-down James Brown. He says it's very Procol Harum. That one's more obvious because you can hear the Whiter Shade of Pale style organs in there. And again, trying to say something here. Now everybody's talking about this new decade. Like you say the magic numbers, then just say goodbye to the stupid mistakes you made. Oh, my memory serves me far too well. So it's hard to know who he's talking to here. Maybe who exactly he was attacking at this moment in the early 90s would be more coherent if I was around in that moment. Again, this one's a fairly catchy song, second or third favorite on the album. Then you get to Mother's Pride, which is the most coherent protest song on the album. It's the first where I think George Michael really knows what he's saying, or at least where the audience can really hear what he's saying. But unfortunately, it makes some of the same musical mistakes as Praying for Time. It's sort of too orchestral, but not in a way that makes the music interesting. But this one is basically an anti-war song. And all the husbands, all the sons, all the lovers gone, they make no difference in the end. Still hear the woman say, your daddy died a hero in the name of God and man. So he's sort of commenting on gender roles here, and what he's saying is, it's maybe toxic masculinity that makes the wars, but women have been convinced, I guess, that the ideal female is to support these men, that they don't say out loud the criticisms they probably have of this militarism. So that's an interesting comment, at least. Not the best song, but possibly the best lyric on the album. The next song, Heal the Pain, so another one of the good three on the album. And this one was supposedly really inspired by Paul McCartney's songwriting in the latter half of the Beatles. It's not saying anything too specific. How can I help you? Please let me try to. I can heal the pain that you're feeling inside. Whenever you want me, you know that I will be waiting for the day that you'll say you'll be mine. So, it's a nice love song with a bit of specificity. I'm sure it could resonate with someone, and it's nice to listen to. Then you have Soul Free, which basically sounds like a Hall & Oates song. And it's, for a Hall & Oates kind of song, the lyrics are saying something. All those insecurities that have held me down for so long, I can say at least I found a cure for these, but at least I know them, so they're not so strong. There's not really too much to say about that one. And then there's a reprise of Waiting for the Day. So I think the biggest mess up of Listen Without Prejudice is it set itself an impossible goal. Is it a pretty good album? Yes. I think the track listing messed up and the production is botched on a few of the songs. But yeah, check it out. See what you think of how close George Michael came to achieving that Listen Without Prejudice standard. So my name is Zach Morgenstern. I'll link to you where you can find my music below, and I look forward to doing more of these close listenings in future. For Ludwig and me, goodbye for now.